have the support for the unprefixed version. Previous versions and IE10 all supported only prefixed. You might have heard about WebSQL. WebSQL was a previous standard that the W3C was working on. The group decided that it was too focused on SQL. You were basically building SQL queries in your web pages, and the group didn't like that approach. They wanted something more modern, so they decided to go to a NoSQL approach with IndexedDB, and they redesigned the whole specification. The specification comes with two APIs, synchronous and asynchronous. I would just say focus on the asynchronous one. That one works both independently or within a web worker. The synchronous API was only designed for web workers, but right now, not only no browser has implemented it, but there's basically no commitment to implementing. So I would just stick to the standard implementation of the asynchronous one. I have a couple of examples here. So as I mentioned, it is prefixed or unprefixed. Right now in the wild, there's a bit of everything. So it is important that you check basically every possible permutation of the possible prefix names. It's not supported in Opera or in Safari, so we don't need the Opera prefix, and Safari unfortunately won't work, so no Mac and no iOS devices. In this example, you see that I look at IndexedDB and IDB transaction. So every IndexedDB requires a transaction, so you cannot make operations on the database if you don't have a transaction open. So you first need to open the database, you look at the data, you can update it, but you always have to have a transaction open, and you can manage the transactions. Here's an example of opening a transaction. Something that I wanted to highlight is that in this example, you see that I'm opening the database. I have a database name, PeopleDB, and I have (1). This is the latest draft of the specification. So they changed how it works, and so I think it's important for you to see this. It's implemented this way in IE10, in the latest versions of Chrome and Firefox, but you might need to support the older version of opening a database, which was more complicated. You had to, in the older version, you had to open the database with no version number. 1 is the version number in this case. And then you had to either check the version, set the version, and maybe update it. The new specification is actually simpler. So when I open the database, I get a number of events. On success and on error are 2 of them. And then on upgrade needed is a new event that was defined with this new specification. Of course, if I have on success and on error, basically I just go ahead and I can start using the database, or I have to manage the error in case, for example, the database is not supported or I cannot move forward. But with the new event on upgrade needed, I have basically the opportunity, I get notified immediately that the schema that I have locally on the client and the schema that I have tried to open are not in sync. So I need to either update the schema or define a new one. In this case, I'm creating an object store. Everything in IndexedDB are object stores. And then I create the structure with name and email. And then I have a for loop that adds the people data that I had prepared previously. So I will use again the object store .add, and I can add the entries for my database. Again, it's a NoSQL database, so I'm entering each value, and then I can query them based, for example, filtering by name, by email. I will not be able to do joins, for example, as you would do on a SQL database. So the use of the database is a little bit different. I mean, if you've never used a NoSQL database, I suggest that you read something on how to get started. The last topic that I want to cover is pointer events. So touch events defined by Apple are the first thing that we had in web browsers to interact with the browser with our finger. And the problem with touch events is that they are specified by Apple. They are unique to Apple, and they are limited to touch. The reality of modern devices is that actually we have touch, we have mouse, we have pen, we could have other forms of input. And the current structure of these events don't work very well. Every web page has to take into account if it's a mouse event, if it's a touch event. The hover is not supported across all forms of input. The pointer events tries to actually bring cohesion and consolidation to these events. They are designed to be easy to migrate from mouse events to pointer events. So for example, the naming of the events is pretty much the same. Pointer down, pointer up, pointer move correspond exactly to the mouse events. So it makes it easy for the implementation. They are backwards compatible because each browser, the specification says how the pointer events have to fall back onto mouse events. So if the page defines the mouse event, the pointer event knows how to treat it. And there's a clear algorithm for browser vendors to implement. It is supported currently only in IE10 with a prefix, so the MS prefix. Google and Mozilla are both looking at the specification, so we can expect both probably an update to the draft, to the current draft, and most of all implementation across many browsers. Unlike what you would expect, Microsoft has already produced a patch for WebKit, and there is a Chrome build that you can test on a computer. I have the links at the end of the presentation. So as I mentioned, they are very similar to the mouse events, but what do they add? How do they make the page development more useful to me? Well, first of all, they are designed to be multi-touch, so they address new needs. When I look at the events offered by pointer events, I have, for example, information about the pointer ID. So each pointer is identified with a unique ID. So at any time during the interaction, the panning or zooming or other interactions that I might define, I will know exactly which of the touch points is doing which movement. They are designed by definition to try not to interfere with the platform. So for example, operations on the viewport like panning and zooming are by definition not allowed for pointer events so that you avoid interjecting with OS operations. And as I mentioned, the naming is very, very similar, so it makes it easy to transition. There are also some additions. You were able, for example, you had an ID for the mouse events to recognize left and right buttons. With multi-touch, of course, we need to address for multiple touch points. So this is addressed to, you have unique values to identify which touch point and which, how many. So was it the first, the second, the third? You might also, if the device supports it, you might also have information about the pressure that the finger or the pen is making on the device. This is a float number that goes from 0 to 1. By default, it's always 0. Otherwise, it's any number up to 1. I have a very short example. As I mentioned, there is not a lot to say about pointer events. They are very similar to mouse events. So again, I'm verifying if it's supported, and then I'm using pointer move, a listener on pointer move to see if I'm moving the finger or the mouse. And then max touch points is a new property that is added by the specification that tells me if the device supports multi-touch or not. In this case, it's simply if it's greater than 1, yes, it supports it. Of course, you need to take into account for devices that, well, browser implementations, they yet don't support this, so you need to have a fallback. And in this case, I'm using the MS prefix because that's what is today implemented in IE10. IE10 comes in different devices. Windows PCs running Windows 8, tablets like the Surface, Windows Phone. Although the engine is always the same, there are some slight differences that you need to take into account. So drag and drop and file API, for example, are not implemented in Windows Phone for various reasons. Drag and drop is not supported because simply you cannot drag and drop an item within Windows Phone. File API is not supported because there's not a proper file system. They felt like privacy might be an issue of websites requesting that you upload something that you shouldn't. These things are coming anyway, in other browsers they are being implemented, so I'm sure they will come in IE 10 too. SnapView is specific only to Windows 8, so of course it's not supported in any other browser, and it's probably not going to be supported in any other browser. And some of the HTML5 form features that I mentioned earlier, like the custom error. The custom error is very useful addition to forms. It allows you to specify a message to show to the user in case that the value entered was not valid. So if you define, for example, a pattern to validate the content and the entered value does not match, you can also show a message very easily. It's just an attribute. This is not supported currently in Windows Phone, but it is supported in Windows 8. As I mentioned, I have a bunch of links. These are some of the content that I wrote about before this presentation. And then I have a bundle on Bitly with a collection of these links plus a lot more that just couldn't fit in one page. Assuming that you're not using sensors, for example, that are not present in Windows 8, you should be fine. Of course, you need to take into account the different viewports. So you will have to write different media queries to address the different browser sizes, but you probably want to do it anyway because of the snap view in Windows 8, for example. So in general, I would say the answer is if you're going from Windows Phone 8 to Windows 8, very easy. If you develop in Windows 8 and you want to use WinJS, that will not work in Windows Phone 8. Go ahead.
Whether it's about WebGL and IE 10
No. No WebGL. It's based on OpenGL. So Microsoft has no support right now for OpenGL, I don't think, in any platform. Excuse me? Databases? Yeah. So question is how to handle the collision of versions with the databases. It's left on you. So you have the on upgrade needed event. So you have that's the moment when you have a chance to basically redefine the schema. So there's no way for you to update the schema. So when you notice a collision, you will actually have to basically wipe the database and recreate it. And if there's any synchronization issue, you should probably manage it on the server and then deliver the content to the client. No, there's no default tools to manage collisions. It's all left to you. So the IndexedDB API is pretty raw. So you have access to the database, you store the data, you read the data, everything else is in your hands. Something that I probably didn't mention is IndexedDB is for large storage. Something that IE 10 supports and some of the other browsers also support is binary files, so blobs. Local storage, you should use local storage for smaller amounts of data or session storage for smaller amounts of data. So I'm not sure about Windows Phone, but IndexedDB on Windows 8 is supposed to have a limit, I think, of 250 megabytes. So we're talking about pretty large data. I saw demo apps where people were downloading images and using them offline. One of the great advantages of IndexedDB, of course, is that you can use it offline once the data is stored locally. All right, well, thank you, and I'll be around. You can find me on Twitter as well.